Hi, my name is Alexander, and I'm going to talk about esports. Esports, short for electronic sports, in its simplest form, is competitive video gaming. It has quickly become a billion-dollar industry where gamers participate in tournaments and league play like traditional sports. In order to dive into the ethical dilemmas surrounding esports, it must be first decided if it should fall into the same category as traditional sports. Once gamers are considered the same as traditional athletes, it will affect the governance of all sports because regulations will need to address the new industry. The esports industry operates under four values: safety and well being, integrity and fair play, respect and diversity, and lastly, positive and enriching gameplay. First off, esports communities are expected to be a safe space and free from any threats, acts of violence, and harassment. Next, unfair play taints the legitimacy of esports. Therefore, any dishonest behavior that detracts from the experience of others is unacceptable. Then there is an emphasis on healthy competition, which is dependent on respect and bringing people together. And then finally, the intent of esports is to help gamers build upon their personal development and growth within a team structure. Each stakeholder also has their own values as well, surrounding their success and achievement in the forms of profits and winning primarily. Also, esports communities are now beginning to value anti-authoritarian culture because the benefits remain with the players and not the centralized publisher. The latter two values really compete heavily with the first four, and that is what creates the ethical dilemmas surrounding cheating, privacy issues, and really the lack of a safe space. As far as alternatives and consequences, if we decide to include esports with traditional sports, then we must redefine successes and achievements in the industry. We then have to address the issue of no governing body because recognition under Title IX, postseason competition and structure, as well as scholarships cannot necessarily happen without a centralized organization in place, such as the NCAA. On the bright side, making esports a sport can mean that the areas where traditional sports are lacking, esports can make up for. For example, with ability inclusiveness in esports, adaptations can to enable a wider range of participants is relatively simple. If we say esports are not a sport, we create an ethical dilemma around equity. If esports are comparable to traditional sports, is it fair to not include them on traditional sports practices? A positive of keeping them separate, however, is esports have been able to thrive during the pandemic, unlike traditional sports that had a bit of stagnation. On the flip side of that, though, traditional sports do not get the benefits from esports that I outlined before. So, if you consider esports a sport, solutions to regulating the separated industry must be evaluated. So, a code of conduct can be a great way to align core principles across the industry. However, with a defragmented and player driven industry, who is expected to draft it? It also must take into full consideration the stakeholders, existing circumstances, and future issues, or ultimately it will fail. Game company intervention. Game publishers value profits, like I talked about before, over social motives. So having those who control the game output would be an effective way to address the regulation issue. However, um, like I said, they value profits. Those values don't align with traditional sports. And then lastly, possibly creating a governing body or joining a governing body is a long-term integration solution. Sports would be able to recognize govern esports would finally be able to recognize governmental standards such as Title IX, as well as organize as a whole rather than individual entities, which is how it normally operates. But on the downside, it will take a lot of work to set up a centralized government, and they do not necessarily. A centralized government does not necessarily equate to the disappearance of ethical dilemmas. The NCAA, for example, still deals with issues with cheating, fair play, and conduct violations. So Here is my proposed solution. Based on the definition of sports, we have research so far in all of our courses. To me, a sport is classified as a competitive game or activity, casual or organized, that focuses on using, improving, and maintaining physical ability. Therefore, professional gaming is a sport because of the high demand placed on the fine motor skills. In the short term, esports will need to decide the stakeholders and create a code of conduct to create a social contract, uh, just because the gaming industry has several issues with privacy, equity, and cheating. It's important to construct those social values around their moral values. In the long term, um, they will need to develop a governing body. It is essential that the code of conduct is revisited at that point to align with the overall mission of the governing body. And as a sport, development across youth, intercollegiate, and professional sports will need to be prioritized. So, this governing body ultimately will assist with consistency. And then, lastly, the game publishers are in an extremely powerful position with there being only a few suppliers of games. So, they can put an emphasis on corporate social responsibility. This is really a prime opportunity for companies to shift their focus away from profits and really towards doing good by their customers. Evaluations, in terms of what ethical theories that I use to develop these solutions, um, ethical social contract, really having the community create the rules and the event individuals abide by them is the example of what a code of conduct is. And then deontological moral theory draws attention to the rightness and wrongness of the actions without any other consideration. So in the esports industry, profits are huge. Winning is huge. There are great consequences of success, or consequences of the actions, but we want to focus on the action. So we look at the corporate social responsibility and governing bodies to really do that. So the solution I provided is a pretty reasonable next step for the gaming industry, but one fact that did not come up in the research is really the general sentiment of gamers on whether they would like to be considered a sport or not. Gaming checks off the same boxes as traditional sport and is its own wealthy industry. So there is a possibility that they don't necessarily want to relate to traditional sports at all. Um, as far as any preventative measures, if I was in a leadership position when esports was becoming an industry, I think that the ones that I presented in this deck, the code of conduct, corporate social responsibility, governing bodies, could have been done at the beginning of the industry becoming its own. However, the debate surrounding whether a sport esports is a sport or not would have most likely still existed just because um the definition of sport is different. And so essentially our ethical dilemma that was created here because we were trying to figure out if it was a sport or not will ultimately still exist.